I've hit record. Riaz, take it away, sir. You have the floor.
Cool. Awesome. So today's talk is called Five Tips for Success, How to Thrive at Your First Dev Job. And I know a few of you either are looking still or have actually just gotten your first job. So it's a very relevant talk. My name again is Riaz Virani. I'm a freelance web developer as of right now. And if anything you see in this talk is really interesting and you want to kind of look at more stuff I've said or written or peruse my brain, you can go to riazv.me, which has various things up there. Oh, sorry, I have to switch over to the other tab, so can't see your faces. This is from the talk I had to give this last weekend. They had me put the slide in because at Atlanta Code Camp, they were like, yeah, you have to talk about you have to put the logos of our presenters in your slides. So you guys also get introduced to that. But anyways, and again, this is for the live presentation. We already kind of did introductions. So I already know kind of there's a good mix in the audience that are sort of at the early part of their career. But let me tell you guys a story time right now. Gather around. All right, I want you to meet Ruby. She is a person in the wild who is probably graduated college and she wants to be a developer. She wasn't someone who went to school for programming, and so that's kind of her trajectory at this point. She decides to go ahead and join, one of the software boot camps. She musters up the courage to do so. Took me a long time to find that boot. I really wanted to put a boot on top of a building. That was the whole purpose of the presentation. So she goes to a boot camp and she does a really great job. She kills it. Some of you might have found your boot camps, you've been through them, but were challenging. But in this case, our character absolutely kills it. After finishing, she does everything in her power to get a job: portfolio site, networking, code credits, practice for interviews, open source projects, etc. And it works. She gets a job. And this is where we spend a lot of the time talking to getting someone to this point, where they're just starting how to get their foot in the door. What happens now? And that's really what the rest of this talk is about. That I think sometimes we focus so much on getting people in the door that we don't actually talk about the sort of soft skills that are not necessarily technical around specifically the common problems people face. And it turns out that many first-year devs struggle in similar areas across companies. I've now been kind of in the industry for about overall really 12 years, but as a full-time dev for about 8. And so I've kind of seen the whole gamut. And like the last job at LoadUp was actually CTO, where we struggled to find more experienced people, and the majority of the team were junior people that we then trained. And so we kind of saw this really firsthand. In many ways, this talk is about all the failures that I had and the things I screwed up because we're not so great at supporting junior devs in their first year. So here are the 5 tips. Promise 5 tips. You have 5 tips. I'm going to mention briefly just what they are, but then we're going to go into more detail on each one. So first, ask and you shall receive. So the general theme there is that you really have to know how to ask for help. Not just ask more, but how do you ask effectively for help? Because you're going to be doing that a lot when you're starting out. Right now, worry later. It's also about you're going to get criticism, and it's really easy, especially if you're not someone who is just overly confident, to have that hammer come down. You get really timid around your code. You become scared to make a mistake. 3, go deep, not wide. This is the one I think that I've heard a lot of people who are more senior agree with me, but it seems to be the one that more junior people violate than anyone else. They kind of do the bootcamp approach of taking a week or two, a bunch of different subjects, but they don't get really deep enough to be productive in any one, which you really need to do when you start. 4, don't put your teammates on a pedestal. I'll get into more details of that, but essentially don't assume everything someone tells you has to be the word of some sort of leader who can't be fallible, right? You're gonna get bad advice too. And how do you deal with the fact that you might get some information from a senior developer to do it one way, but it's actually not the right way? The last one's actually more tactical. It's called pseudocode is your friend. If you don't know, pseudocode is the way of writing code. It's sort of more human readable words before you actually write your actual code. And this is something that you don't need as much sometimes as a senior developer, but you definitely need to practice that as a junior developer because it's going to help you get acclimated to the syntax of the language. So ask and you shall receive. Let's talk about this one in more detail. Now, one thing I'm going to do at the end of each of these sections, by the way, I'm going to just ask if anyone can give me a personal story where they can run and relate to the point that we have. Now, if I don't get anyone, then we're going to go ahead again. In real life, I was kind of just calling on people, and then it kind of worked, but we don't get to do that here. Anyway,
definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, definitely. Like anytime I see, like my career has been in testing and QA for a while, and like actually writing in, getting into a code base and reviewing and writing code is like, oh God, they're gonna hate me. Oh, this is the worst thing I've. Oh no, this isn't good.
Yep. Yeah. There'll be a section at the kind of end of each kind of section, and I'm going to ask for kind of people's thoughts. And yeah, I'd love to have you kind of give more detail into kind of your personal experience. That's sort of the goal here, is to help people understand that, like, it's not really these very nuanced technical things. It's often these universal experiences that are more on the soft skill side that really make the difference. But we're going to jump back to Ruby real quick, back to our story. So Ruby gets a ticket, and those who are new, a ticket's basically something someone's asked you to do. So it's like, a feature to add or a bug to fix, etc. Ruby gets a ticket, but she's not sure how to proceed. She's afraid she's going to do it wrong and be found out as a fraud. What does she do? And someone here mentioned that they were an imposter. So this is kind of that targeting that sensation, right? Of like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, you've given me a task, but I'm not sure how to fulfill it. Here's the answer. When you feel that emotion, you can't wait forever to ask for help. So don't wait forever to ask for help. And don't also throw your hands up and give up. And I've generally seen people on these two extremes, right? They either come in every morning and say, you're working on this ticket, and they give, yep, I'm working on it, and 4 days later, to everyone else, they're making progress, but to them, they're just banging their head against the wall, and that they're really afraid, especially the farther they go down that path. It'll look even worse when they say, I haven't really made any progress. Or they'll hit a tipping point and they'll throw their hands up, and that ends up being a really frustrating experience for everyone. Now, before I kind of come to the final point I want to make, every time I kind of give one of these points of advice, in my mind, when I hear them, I kind of hear this like little voice in the back of my head that's like, it's not so easy, man. Like, if it was that easy, I'd be doing it already. And what is that little voice? Says, but won't I annoy people if I ask for help? Won't I look like an imposter, etc.? And that can be true. That has actually happened. It turns out the reason why is not that they were asking for help, but they weren't asking intelligently. And this is a really big skill I found across really any professional discipline. When you ask for help, you have to ask for help really, really well, and you have to broadcast and communicate what's happening. We'll talk a little bit about kind of ways to be prepared when you ask for help. But below this, I've really just put a paragraph about what could a status update look like in that last case of like, I'm not sure what to do. I might have a guess that was probably wrong of how to do it. And instead of just saying, oh, I'm working on it. Yeah, I'm working on it. Here's a different update you could give that morning, right? Hi, everyone. So I'm currently working on X feature. I'm still working through the right approach for it, but right now approach Y seems the best. So I'm going to keep at it for today, but if I don't make good progress, I'd like to grab someone else from the team really quickly tomorrow to talk through it and get me unstuck. Now, your manager hears that, especially if I was hearing that, I would be like, you have done so much work for me. This is the managing up thing, if you've ever heard of that. You've identified there's a problem. You've told me you identified there's a risk, right? You've kind of also given me some nuance as to what you are trying, because someone else might jump in, right? Say, oh, no, go look over here and try to do this other thing, right? Follow that pattern. You've also given me a time box for which you're going to keep working it yourself. And if you don't make progress, here's the next little piece of assistance you can use, right? Not grabbing someone, like offloading it to someone else. What's the next thing I could give you? Like, could you get someone else's help to talk through it, and maybe they can focus you in the right area? That's the work of a manager, and you've just done your manager's job and made their life really easy. And that's going to give you a lot of credibility with the team. So ask for help, but ask intelligently. And the second point that's not on the slide that just is really in some ways obvious, but it's like when you go ask really specific questions and have done your work ahead of time, right? So if someone says, if your problem is you're getting an error message, you don't know why, if the first thing someone asks you and you haven't done is, have you Googled the error message? That's a bad sign, right? So you have to actually do the work of trying to solve the problem and then be like, okay, I have this problem, I tried this, I tried that. And that's again part of asking intelligently when you're actually asking. So you won't lead to that I'm annoying people if you're actually asking in a way that is reflective of the underlying challenge and not just because you didn't put in the effort. So this is where I want to pause and actually, like, if anyone has, again, this is a more interactive presentation, I'd love to get some people's experience of like, yeah, I totally resonate with this, or you don't resonate with it and I'm totally off base, and that's totally cool as well. Matt, you want to chime in? You wanted to kind of share a story at the start. No, Matt. But yeah, anyone else? I'm sure.
Hey, sorry. No, I was in the bathroom. I apologize. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Uh, honestly, that's what you just said is paramount. Having worked in testing for a number of years, that's basically sort of exactly the approach I've taken. And now that I'm hopefully doing okay, it's like, hey, what is in fact, earlier today, I was looking at a code review, or a PR rather. And I was like, well, okay, hey, what is this underscore that we're using here? Oh, that's the Lodash. Oh, okay, let me research that. Cool. And then I want to say about a week ago, I was trying to fix a flaky RSpec and figured I had an idea of what I was doing, and spoke with our lead architect who's here. I wasn't so afraid anymore, and it ended up working out, which is kind of nice. But yeah, no, that's what you're saying is absolutely par for the course.
Yep, sounds great. Appreciate the feedback.
And I would say, as someone who has employed other developers or junior developers, it is not good to go 2-3 days of stand-ups with your coworkers or the scrum master thinking you're making progress, to then only admit that you've not been making any progress at all, and you need to pair with the senior developer to unstick yourself. Those are the types of things. Even I don't want to scare anyone, but someone who's managed developers on teams, that's the kind of stuff that gets remembered when it comes to performance review times. It's not the poor performance of being stuck or being junior, but it's the poor performance of not communicating effectively and burning billable hours churning without arriving at a solution.
That's a very, very, very good point.
So, because really the thing that separates professional development versus hobby development, all things is the ability to consistently build working software on a repeatable basis over time. That's really the gap. Anyway, I'll stop, but I just wanted
to. Yeah, on that note, I remember my first non-contract full-time coding job. My architect told me that if I am stuck on something, that I should not be stuck on something for more. I think he said more than 20 minutes, and that would be like the point at which I should definitely approach him and ask. So he actually had a specific amount of time that he recommended trying to work on something on my own before asking.
That's interesting. Thank you for that.
I think, Joe, it's a really interesting point. I would almost say that if your team doesn't have that and you're new to a team, that's even a good question to ask. Like, hey, on this team, like, I'll get stuck because I'm new. It could even be you're an experienced developer's new team. How long should I wait? Like, what's the right kind of culture? And some people will say, well, it's okay. Like, sometimes teams move slowly. You can be stuck. If you're stuck more than half a day, then things. Sometimes it can be 20 minutes, right? And it's like, a lot of that does depend on the culture of the team. And there's teams that are always like collaborating and jumping on, like, hey, let's jump on a quick Zoom thing together or whatever. And there's teams that just are very async, where they're going to expect you to wait a bit longer. So you'll help yourself a lot by learning the culture of your team, right? That's usually something that's already kind of a thing. It's not really a thing you're establishing when you're new.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Riaz.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to jump on to the next one, but yeah, we'll pause at the end of each of these to kind of get some reflections from people. So the next point is write now, worry later. I love puns. I feel like I'm great at them, but my wife would disagree. So continue with our story. So Ruby gets that ticket, right? Ruby does the best she can and puts up a PR. PR, for those of you that aren't familiar, is GitHub terminology for pull requests, which means it's a proposed change to the code. The next day, which proposed change to the code that other people can review and comment on. The next day, it's got 20 comments on it. It's been sent back. She will have to start over. She's crushed. She's not even sure if she wants this job anymore. So this is when your PR is marked up with a bunch of notes that you would lead you to believe maybe you did something wrong. Before I go on to the next slide, generally this presentation is from the perspective of the junior developer. Like, what can you do, right? This is the one part where, like, I would say there's a lot of onus actually on the senior developer, because if you have someone new and you're having to put a lot of comments on it, maybe that's just the culture that you do that. Not putting in a slight note in the final review saying, hey, I know these are a lot of notes. You've still done a lot of good work in here. You'll get better. It's okay. Keep going. Can just change someone's world. But I know a lot of times everyone just focused on their own job. They're not even, trying to make a criticism. They're just like, I just got to review this PR, blah, 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 move on, right? And they're moving on to the next task and really thinking about sort of the empathy that it needs to really do this job and to really coach other people. So that's a really important factor, because we also have some people on here that are senior to really kind of think about, like, how is the other person receiving this? You may just think it's a statement of fact, but when someone reads something in their head, they can read it angrily, especially when it looks like it's, hey, you did something wrong, you change your code. So this is the answer, right? And I actually get pushback on this sometimes. Like the point I made, if you're a junior developer, there's just one thing you have to start with the premise of you will write a lot of mediocre code as you improve. Embrace it and ask your teammates to embrace the process as well. Now, when I mean write a lot of mediocre code, I don't mean intentionally mediocre. I mean, the answer is you're new. You wouldn't start, playing the violin and be upset at yourself in a week that someone came to you and was correcting you, like, oh, you did that note wrong, right? So think of it like an artist kind of takes feedback. You have to be true to yourself and not let your self-confidence get shot, but realize that you're going to have a good amount of mediocrity. So I think it's better to acknowledge that than to be like, no, you're doing great, everything's fine. It's like, no, you're going to write shittier code when you're new, but it's part of the process. Therefore, get through the process as quickly as possible. So here's the voice in the back of your head, right? So just do my job poorly, right? Like, is the answer that if you're new, I should just be contributing less to the team and be okay with it? And the answer is, you're not getting paid to write code. You actually are. This is maybe, I wonder what Frank would think about this. Your job is not to write code. Your job is to try. Your job is to put in your best effort. Like, software is just not a precise field. Maybe running a repeatable, optimizing performance on some narrowly defined scope is, but that is not what almost any of us do. We're kind of it's a creative endeavor. And the reality is that shitty code is very different from flawed code written by people trying their best. Especially when you come in, you're going to see flawed code everywhere, right? Doesn't mean those people were shitty. They were doing the best they could with the resources and time they had. They were just trying to do their best. So, and this really comes in and becomes more evident when you're working, not even with a job, when you're working as a freelance client. You have to explain to your customer that, like, your specification is not going to be exactly correct. Neither is my work. You're really paying me to give you my best effort to do my best job to accomplish the business goal you have. And that is really the perspective you have to have as well. So don't be afraid of your code. When that PR gets marked up, it's just an opportunity to learn, try your best, go in. The next time it'll be a little bit better. You're not getting paid to give them a perfect PR. That's not feasible, and it's really actually not what your job description is. So I'll pause here. Anyone has any thoughts?
I would add, and it really depends on the product and stuff, but for most of us who are writing kind of line of business software to spec, and it probably applies to game development too. I just haven't been in that space in a while. Our job is to arrive at technical solutions to solve certain business processes, often with software. You're often working within the software, but if you can look at it and say, actually, I can solve this requirement without writing any code at all, then that's a good answer to have, and that's not a bad answer at all. Or if you can go back and say, these requirements are ambiguous, and if I just implement it, then it's going to have this poor result in the future. That's another really good discussion to have. So yeah, our job is not to write code. Our job is to produce working software, and that involves a lot of either not writing code. That's the simple version. There's a lot of not writing code in this job as a professional developer. So, agreed.
Yep. Anyone else have a quick thought? We'll go on to the next one.
I mean, besides, I don't know if anybody else has worked on a code base that Riaz has with flawed code written by people who are trying their best. Besides snarky comments about that, I have nothing to contribute.
Basically, Nico just telling me I left them a shit show. What do you say?
Not at all. Everybody else is.
So I'm in my first month as a developer, and I'm pairing with guys who have been doing it for 10 years. And the thing that I notice is that all code starts off flawed, and it gets better. You rewrite. So I thought, I was just writing terrible, awful code, but like, it's not that bad, and it gets better, and you refactor, and so it's just getting to see the process has made me realize it's not the amazing code that I've read from senior developers. It doesn't just show up all at once. It's a process, and it takes time.
Yep, totally agree. All right, I will jump to the next one. Go deep, not wide. No pun there, but all right. So back to Ruby. Ruby loves learning. At her boot camp, they taught her 7 programming languages and frameworks. She feels overwhelmed with where to focus on her new job. It all seems too advanced compared to her boot camp. So what I'm talking about here, if any of you have been to a boot camp, this is at least to remind a few that I've seen, they, in their marketing spiel, will be like, well, we'll spend a couple weeks to teach you iOS. We'll spend a couple weeks teaching you Python and a couple weeks teaching you front end, right? And you're like, oh my God, I'm learning so many things. But it doesn't really serve you at the end because you don't have any sufficient experience in any one of them or skills specifically to be productive on a production team. So a lot of this is because boot camps and the tech zeitgeist are all obsessed with the new, and excessive variety is a sort of a marketing spiel. And your job is to really not get sucked into it, right? There's sort of an element here of like the thing everyone's doing and everyone's talking about. And the right answer is the sort of simple opposite, which is to really focus. You only need one foot in the door when you get your job, and the most important factor in terms of getting hired and staying on the team is that you need to be able to be productive in some capacity and not fully in training mode. So you'll be much more productive if you have a thing you're actually pretty good at that you can contribute. It could just be CSS, it could be the DevOps, it could be your backend, it could be whatever. But one thing that you're actually really good at, not just a bunch of things that you're kind of have some familiarity with. So the voice in the back of your head. Well, if I do it that way, like, won't I never really become a fully rounded developer that like knows all the things? Won't I just be the person who just, I'm on a team full of people that love backend and hate the front end, and I'm just a CSS person, right? Because I decided to focus on an area that my team needed specialized expertise and no one wanted to touch. That's not really true. Focus is important. Focus on one specific technology that your team needs help with. Specific expertise does a couple things. It's going to give you the credibility and the ability to be productive, right? You're going to have, this person does a great job here. You'll learn the rest over time. I just don't find it true that if it turns out like you get pigeonholed into the one thing no one wants to do, you're still on the team contributing every day. You're learning the business domain. And the fact that you can be productive in one area doesn't mean that you can't then just keep growing, right? If you got told to work on the front end and they're like, oh, great, you can be productive there. We'll all go write the Ruby. Doesn't prevent you from learning Ruby and being like, hey, like when there's a small Ruby ticket or when you're debugging an issue, you can just debug it yourself. But if you don't have any expertise, it's going to be really hard to be productive. And that perception of you being more someone who's taking resources from the team versus contributing will be strengthened. So focus, focus, focus. And this kind of is a Venn diagram. Things your team kind of needs and the things that you know and are familiar with. And you got to find a couple things in the middle and communicate that with your manager, being like, hey, let me focus here for the next 3 months on these kinds of issues so I can get stuff done for you. And at the same time, I can learn something really, really effectively. So thoughts on that?
Strongly agree.
And I would say this is really specific to like your first year, right? If you want to try to learn other things and they're like you happen to be in a culture that's like you have to be in this like separate silo for like multiple years and you're only doing one thing and you're never like allowed to move around or explore other intellectual or technical curiosities because you have maybe it's not a culture that's that great. That's not really a thing that's a problem with this strategy. That turns out usually to be a problem with the team and the company culture, right? Like if they're not letting people work in different areas. Yeah.
I was going to say, amen. Also, having a focus about understanding about not to use a tool that is not in the best interest of the customer of your system that you're building. And I'm gonna pick on Angular at a moment. 7 years ago, if you had your fresh boot camp grad, of the genre of Joe and some others, and they came out and said, everyone is doing Angular. We're going to implement this with Angular. But it was not the right technology. They just literally needed some CSS markup on some web forms in a Ruby on Rails CRUD app. Okay? Now, Joe is 3 jobs later, and that company is facing a bill potentially of many tens of thousands of dollars to rewrite a front end with no clear path forward. Joe, I should have picked a hypothetical. Joe would have never done this to anyone. But I've seen this pattern over and over. The lesson is don't add technology that isn't actually needed just because that's the thing the cool kids are doing. That's really my rant. I'll stop ranting.
Frank, you cannot blame Joe. It was my decision to use Angular.
Oh, okay.
It's true. You're describing
it's Joe's problem.
it is.
I laugh.
It's so funny because like we are currently in the process of trying to move away from Angular.
In my defense, I was also the one who said we should get rid of it.
I just happen to agree. So yes,
that was a hypothetical that landed too close to the home.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you'd like to add based on that, like for people to learn from? Because now this is actually perfect. This is Riaz's point wound back a few years, and what does it look like several years in the future when something like this was made?
I will say as well, kind of sort of changing subjects, that I recently interviewed several recent bootcamp grads, and it was pretty common to hear from them. Oh yeah, I am really interested in Ruby, and I learned Ruby and this and that and the other thing at the boot camp, and and I look at their GitHub profiles and see nearly all of their repositories are what do you call it? The React projects that they have going on.
Yeah, Rails -- API.
Right.
So
that the Riaz, your point for this section definitely feels very familiar to that situation.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's kind of like the expert, touched everything, don't really know any of them particularly well, kind of situation.
Kind of like if you heard that, like if you don't know one language, it's really hard to learn another foreign language. Like another computer language. I mean a language. So you need to know one sufficiently well to learn another. But people who just haven't learned any language sufficiently well enough have a really hard time learning any language at a sufficiently deep level.
I think it goes beyond language as well. Like we're working with a platform or a tool of the web. And when you start to really get into Ruby on Rails, and then maybe you branch out a little bit into the front end and start talking about what's actually happening in that connection cycle or in that response cycle, you start to understand where these other tools can actually fit in. Whereas like if you don't know like the shared verbiage between them of what these things are actually doing, you have to both learn new languages and what they're actually doing at a deep level at the exact same time. And that's really hard to get that like object of like association. I don't know what the term is, but when you're like, oh, this thing is really kind of like this thing, and so it's easier to learn that way, where they're doing the same thing, they just have different words on top of them. So for me, it's like syntax is huge. Like to basically be able to read, if you don't understand the syntax, how do you read what someone's trying to teach you?
So I want to pivot on that for a very half second. Guess I don't have any evidence of this, but I worry, and I'm hoping this isn't the old man shaking his hand at the clouds situation. But I worry that our folks that grow up with a consumer-oriented iPad or tablet-driven environment with like almost no opportunity to learn how it works under the hood, it seems, compared to some of us that came up before, are they going to, are we facing a cliff of disadvantage for learning how to actually do this stuff? And I don't know, maybe that's just generalized fear, but
no, because if you build, like Frank, it doesn't matter when you start to build. This is my opinion. Like when you decide to start building, it's the day that you start learning about these things. And until then, you're just a consumer, you know. And then these guys who are growing up on tablets are gonna like their kids are gonna be growing up in virtual reality, you know. And the same concept will come by. It's like, when are they gonna know how to build something on a tablet? They probably never will unless they decide to become a builder and to be a student of the things that they're going to create. And not all people are creators, you know.
I think your worry is true, but the layers of abstraction just keep adding. You know, just like today, you no longer worry about, you know, putting hard drives in server racks. We have things in the cloud for that, but we have higher level problems to solve. There will be more layers of abstraction 20 years from now that's, you know, will occupy people's brain.
Not all of them are helpful. My new washer and dryer have Bixby integrated. They're Samsung Bixby, and I'm like, I don't know who actually puts their stuff in their washer or dryer and then gets their phone out and then tries to configure the cycle instead of just hitting a freaking button on the screen. But
that does not seem like an increased value add at all. Anyway, Riaz, thank you everyone for the aside and that stuff. Riaz, back to you. But it's interesting where we went with this, you know, focus. The last thing I'll say is, and this is having been not career switching, but when customer facing, prospective customers in my line of work only let you really be really good at 2 or 3 things as a company. In reality, most of us can be good at more than that. But this happens when you get hired in. Oh, all I'm is this, and if I want to change, I need. You can change, but focus. Put yourself forward as being focused on one part, and put in the work to be good at that part. And if you repeat that long enough, and next thing you know, you're the go-to expert in your field. So there's value in sticking with it. Anyway.
Yep. So it's 2 more left. So next one, don't put your teammates on a pedestal. For those of you that listen to Ruby Rogues, I did a podcast interview about this subject. This is the one I think like people agree with, but there was a bunch of senior developers on there that I think like it's kind of controversial. So anyways, go have more Ruby. So senior developer gives Ruby some guidance on a ticket, but it's not working. What does she do? She doesn't want to disrespect the senior developer by doing it her way. This has happened to me even with other developers, right? And especially will happen to you as a more junior developer because you're going to be asking like, hey, I don't know how to do this. Someone tries to help you and is like, we could try this. We should create a class here with an interface like this, this, and this, and make this, call that thing, whatever. You're like, oh, okay, I think I kind of get it. And then you start doing it. But it's not working. So what do you do in that circumstance? So the answer is you just can't force a square peg into a round hole. It's your job, again, I meant specifically is your job to voice the friction that you're noticing. it'll usually be one of like two things. It's either 50% of the time they explain something to you and somehow, developers are pretty bad at talking about code, and they essentially, gave you instructions that you didn't interpret correctly. So what they're talking about and what you're trying is not the same thing. And two, it's that they're just wrong, and it's really the wrong approach, and they were guessing and they guessed wrong. If it's number one, the right answer is show code, don't talk about it. If it's number two, you just have to hope you have someone who's got the maturity to be like, yeah, you're right, it's not quite working, let's try something else, instead of forcing you down the hole. So the most generic word in the world, communication. There's just no way around it in this case. But you have to recognize that if you're a bit newer to this field, senior devs are not gods, they're your peers. Tell the senior developer or developers what you've actually found and show them. Share your screen, find a way, don't talk about them. Ask for clarification, be like, is this really supposed to be this way? Here's the problem I'm noticing. Don't say it's not working, give them something very specific. Half the time, it turns out their approach is wrong and they'll admit it, and you can iterate to the next thing. Sometimes also when they were talking to you, they were spitballing ideas of what we should do and they're not sure themselves, right? So you have to kind of communicate it. And if you maybe someone who's just really kind of cold and all business, you're not sure how they're going to take it, you just have to find a way to communicate in a way that's going to be effective for them to listen to you. But remember, again, they're not God. The funny thing that I think a lot of people, especially that are new, don't fully understand is like, you kind of look to the senior devs in their team, but if you look across the field, there's so many opinions on everything. You can find an equal number of senior developers on like most issues, on testing, on how to do like, should your code be more functional or more pure OO, and like the fact that they're arguing amongst themselves. And I'd say the major reason people even do like service or rigid architecture that is because like they can't get senior developers to agree on things, to give you some clue that like this is a very messy business, whole software stuff. So you have to kind of talk about what you're seeing and can't assume that because someone who's more experienced told you it should be this way, that it's actually the right way to do it. So thoughts?
I think the hard thing from the developer's perspective is like understanding. I like to think of like a lot of things I hope for like as a benevolent monarchy when I go into stuff. Like I want to be able to express my opinions and have them heard, but I also like as a grown professional adult now. It took me a long time to get here. Like I understand that sometimes I will be told to do something I don't believe is right. And moralistically, I'm not going to do it if it's not right like that. But if it's a part of the like a code pattern or to use certain method, and I'm like, but this is like I'm 90% positive this is going to be slower. But this is exactly like there's been a line drawn in the sand. You still have to just go with it. And having the ability to communicate and accept an answer that isn't yours. I think it goes both ways, right? Like the senior needs to be able to do it, but the junior also, even if positive, sometimes just has to accept that their answer isn't the one going to be used. You know?
I think it's a good point. I think there's a very like someone can say, I see what point you're trying to make, but we have to go this other way, versus if you don't express it at all. Like it could be like, I see where your perspective is, but we're just still going to do it this way. Yeah, I think either way, and it could also be, and this is actually a unique note if you remember, but this just happened actually on the load up team where like there was one point, I think it was like on sort of way how we did templating, where like literally everyone disagreed with me. And the fact eventually that everyone disagrees made me reconsider, and then I changed my mind. So like there, but yeah, like if our culture at that company was one where people didn't talk or people, didn't speak up because, technically I was there above them, then we wouldn't have even found that better answer. So there's definitely a team aspect here, but despite the fact that when you're really, really new, you've got a whole bunch of anxiety, you're already trying to deal with your own imposter syndrome, there to ask you to then disagree with someone can sometimes be really difficult, right? And to voice that. But it's really, really important, and learning how to do it in a way that is not both disrespectful, but is really about the point. And like I said, a lot of time you'll also just find that everyone guesses wrong. And maybe voicing that friction actually kind of helps, even if you end up having to do it the same way anyways. But you still have to voice it. You just have to find a way,
And another thing I want to talk about approaches, and we talked about software quality, like in terms of like good code or bad code or mediocre code, and those are all true. But in my experience, one of the delineations of junior to senior is not necessarily just years of experience, but recognizing what good enough is better, because you need to move on to the next thing. Sort of that budgeting of time, if not money, which they're often equated. Someone who says, oh, I got to get this right, I don't want to get this wrong, but a workable solution shipped today and on to the next pull request, we can revisit that later, is often the right answer over a technically superior solution shipped next sprint and now the entire project is behind. Just a thought experiment there about really what one of the defining characteristics in my mind is. A senior dev is not just that they know how to code better, it's that they are in a leadership position. And that leadership comes with the experience of understanding constraints outside of the code itself.
And that's even, I would say, the thing to communicate is like, I've definitely had cases where I could say, oh, we should do it this way, here's the proper way. But for you to communicate up, okay, like I'm more junior, that's going to take me X amount of time versus getting here is going to take me Y. That's something maybe I didn't know. And then therefore I can help make that trade-off. It's like, okay, you're right. For right now, based on time and priority, we should just do the limited version and move forward. But if you just don't say anything, right, they're going to be like, oh, it would take me 2 days. It should take you 2 days, right, to do the fully baked version. And that'll put you in a bad spot again because you'll have incorrect expectations from your team. So move on to the last and final point, and we'll just have more general discussion if people want to kind of talk about other ideas they have or other tips they would have. But this one is a bit unique. It's called pseudocode is your friend. This one is a very tactical point compared to sort of the more philosophical points that we've been doing for the first 4. So the finale is our final time with Ruby, so we can say goodbye to her after this. Ruby is starting to feel comfortable, maybe it's been a few months, but she's still writing code slower than other devs in the team. How can she be more efficient? And this is, again, the thing I remember having. Everyone has this, takes you more time to get the same thing done because you have to think about it more, and a lot of the patterns, even if it's not about programming in general, the patterns in the code base are newer to you when you're just starting out. So here's a very tactical point that does help most people, but it's not a catch-all. One thing I noticed was when you're just starting, especially if you're new to the programming language, or if you're new to coding in general, you're never going to have fully baked understanding in your head of the programming language. Thinking of the logic and the syntax at the same time actually is almost like context switching. Because if you're senior, meaning you've just been using that programming language forever, you kind of do both in once. Like you kind of think through the logic and the syntax just flows out of you. But if not, then it actually is like a different part of your brain you're exercising. So one is literally write pseudocode, almost as you're explaining to someone what the code did, right? Like if you had to just tell me what the code was, and write out some sentences and phrases or whatever, or even some people say they just make, they're thinking of interfaces, they just write sort of the class and they write just the method names. Whatever it is that kind of outlines the logic to you, whatever works for you, finish that and then look at me like, this makes sense. And then switch to the other side of your brain, which is just translate that to syntax. And then you can go back and refactor or just if you need to after that. But your brain's going to be faster doing a specific kind of thing versus doing both at the same time. If it helps you not entirely, will help you at least a little bit. So this is the point here, syntax stuff. If you're, while it is necessary because it's computer programming, it is almost in some ways an obstacle to actually expressing the logic. Now, Ruby is better than most languages because it actually was designed to make its syntax very readable, but it still is new syntax. Remember, senior devs have been writing for so long, the syntax of code is second nature to them. If you're not there yet, separate the process of thinking about the logic and writing in the syntax of the programming language as separate. To a reasonable extent, try mechanisms that work for you, and often it'll really help you when you're junior. And then eventually you may not need it as much because you can kind of just intuit the syntax. You don't have to even think about it anymore. So, you know what? I'm going to finish actually, and then we can have some thoughts about this because it's the last point anyways, and we'll just get to the sort of general Q&A. So, basically it's graphic, my last point. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. So I'll leave this up for a bit, but any thoughts on the pseudocode as your friend or any kind of more general thoughts that on the subject anyone wants to throw out there?
I gotta say, your stick figure art is a remarkable resemblance, Riaz. Your skill at
I
art
know.
far surpasses my
Yeah.
own.
Yes, it was taken from my FBI rap sheet.
Awesome.
I had to pull it. I actually literally had to pull my FBI rap sheet one day for like something back when I was in federal consulting. And literally, if you don't have anything, it just says no records found. Just very, very disappointing because you're sitting there being like, I'm pulling my FBI rap sheet. It just says we have no records of this person. So, rather from there.
So my experience with the pseudocode thing was that my first week of coding, the senior dev and I were pairing, and to communicate the intent of what we wanted to make, he wrote about 10 lines of pseudocode. And the amazing thing to me was it took us 5 hours to write the code, the actual code, but it all worked exactly as he sketched it out. Like there were no changes. He sketched it out. It took us 5 hours to make it. It worked perfectly as.
Hey, Nelson, I think you inadvertently muted yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, but he basically we wrote the code. It wrote the code in 5 hours. It worked as he originally planned, and it was just amazing to me that it could be done. And it was good modeling, so I want to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good point. I didn't think of that in the context of pairing, but we went back to like how do you ask for help? Sometimes if you even if you're like, okay, here's kind of the generalized approach, what we're really talking about is sometimes it's pseudocode. Sometimes it's go look here, this other part of the code we're doing something similar, but it could also be, hey, can you just help me write a few sentences to like lay out the flow of the logic, and then I'll figure out the rest and actually translate it. But actually could be a really good mechanism to be like, how can someone help you without sort of like doing the work, right? And sometimes it's helping you write some of that pseudocode out, or at least they can read your pseudocode and see, oh, here's the flaw, like that doesn't exactly work the way you think, and they can actually give you feedback before you start going down the route of writing code.
And I found that high level pseudocode, like if else kind of stuff, is incredibly valuable even talking with like business executives, because these are smart people. They understand conditional logic and math and stuff. And so, we don't have to get into the details of like the Ruby or the Java or whatever the implementation language is a really powerful technique and use of that in communicating clearly and eliciting very correct requirements, like when you're like having a debate over how it should work.
I think that also works with your seniors or anybody that you're pair programming with in general. Is there's so much debate about project requirements or how Riaz, we're doing availability notifications. We're refactoring that at the moment, and there's again. So we're there's a million things that it touches, and not one person has been like the person who's refactored it 7 times. So there isn't one product expert. And so each person who comes in is, if you're able to start with just a pseudocode framework and pair with them about like, what am I missing? What are the requirements that we have? What is the system state that I'm supposed to be in control of at the or know of at that time? Like pseudocoding that all out, at least with light service, that's what I started with, was just like writing what I thought the actions of this service would be, and going all the way through it and finding all the pitfalls that we were missing or the things that we weren't going to do correctly first. And that took 2 days of just research with pseudocode to finally start to write. And then once it was, we have so many actions that are, so many things that are already shared or so many scopes that are already there that like plugging the code together was almost fairly simple for the first part out of 16 parts.
Yep, totally agree.
And more generally, not even pseudocode, but doing some upfront design, whether it's listing up requirements, making sure they're clear, but maybe like doing some diagramming of how the data should look like, how the data should flow, often helps also.
I think it's a really good point, actually. I think like that's maybe a thing that in general, while some teams do more of it, some teams do less, but especially when you're starting out and more junior, like spending a lot of time, uh, sometimes a disproportionate, maybe 80-20 split of like, how do I express what I propose to do? It could be writing pseudocode. It could be making like a process flow diagram, right? Like if you can review that with someone, if it's not been provided to you, if there's ambiguity in the requirements, a lot of times it also just happens in your junior is like the more experienced people on the team, they have so much context about the business domain or how things have been done in the past. They may not spec something out because they have it intuited in their head versus you're going to just want to spell it out more. So if someone looks at the more detail you can give them to be like, here's what I propose to do, here's how I kind of see it before you're writing the code, the less likely you're going to have those like the really painful kind of changes in a PR review or whatever, when it's like the foundation of it. Like, no, you need to do a different approach. That really sucks, right? That really hurts your self-confidence. But if you're just talking about like, can you just adjust this here? Can we refactor this method into 2 methods, right? Or whatever. They're like, yeah, I can do that in like 30 minutes, right? So this is really aimed at how do you avoid those really big challenges that you can misconstrue as you're going along till you get to the end. The biggest one is that, yeah, a lot of times that pseudocode will help someone who's more senior if they review it before you get coding, the sort of big hole in your code, right? That you can figure out before you start coding, or the big hole in your approach. Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, that was the whole thing, I guess, for about an hour. So I will continue talking. I think it's a good subject in general to think about, but I'm actually curious to ask you guys, like, is there some other tip, or maybe a different kind of tip that any of you who either, recently went through sort of that transition of like, and I'm specifically honing in on that first year that you first became a developer, like would have helped you, or that you've seen help someone else that I didn't talk about at all today?
I'm going to say embrace the art of troubleshooting. You literally cannot be good enough at troubleshooting, and it's the skill that separates vastly the barely making it juniors to the most valuable members of a development team.
Yeah, I agree. That going from like it's not working to how do you figure out how it's not working?
Systematically going about figuring that out. And there's material online about like root cause analysis, and you mentioned Googling the error message. Like, look at that. All of a sudden I got like a crazy thing going on. I think that's Nico. I'm not sure about that.
Riaz, I think that might be you.
Oh, I guess it was Riaz. Interesting. I think it's almost like something got unplugged. What I was gonna say is like of the people I've worked with in over 20 years, probably only 2 were truly good at troubleshooting, and to this day they are the best developers I've ever known. One of them at the time was 14 years old. We're still friends to this day. The kid was natural at it. But that skill is a very, very, very valuable skill to developing yourself. It's not working, and it's just saying, it's not working. Systematically figuring out why and fixing it is huge. Anyway, that would be my tip for a 6th topic for a junior developer to focus on. I guess we lost Riaz.
Is here. I think they're great tips there. I can actually audio things happening again.
You, Riaz, is doing it again.
What I've been thinking of as you were going through these tips is pretty much for every points that you listed, there are also tips for the team or the company hiring a new developer to help them get started, like proactively helping them, pairing, pointing them to the go deep portion, help steering them towards what you believe is the most valuable for them to learn, and just in general creating the right environment. being humble, being empathetic in code reviews. All these things could probably have like a near representation of 5 tips for the team onboarding a new developer there.
It really is. I think you're right. Yeah, it's both sides of the coin. Is that kind of what you're saying? It's not just here you should do this, but also how do you have an environment that's conducive for juniors and their growth and productive work.
If the environment is not set up, nobody wants to be slowed down by a junior developer, then like the junior developer will not thrive in that environment.
No.
Yeah. I remember being a junior or before I was a junior, after I graduated code school and before I was a junior, I was looking for jobs and hearing a lot of, well, we can't take a junior right now, or a lot of we don't even look at the code school graduate. There was a lot of that, and I think on that point, Dimitri, I totally agree, and think that sort of approach would help those companies sort of gain their own confidence in their own ability, not only to hire juniors or recent code school graduates, recent college graduates even, and be able to accept them onto the team, if they have the right attitude, then they can become very valuable to the company very quickly.
Good word. Good word.
I think one of the things we forgot to put in there for junior developers is like, don't be afraid to ask for help on that communication issue. I don't know if he mentioned that before I got here. He did. Perfect. Because that is, I think, one of the hardest things for me to get over my own hubris, to be like, I've got this, but it's 3 hours in and it should have, yeah, exactly. I've got this. Like, I'm going to dominate.
In the bag.
In the bag. 3 hours later, I'm still saying I've got it in the bag, but it's just then starting to be like, I might be taking too long on this.
Yeah. I guess I have this one more test case to write. It'll be good. 6 hours later.
Yeah. So it probably should have kicked in at about 35 minutes to an hour of doing this thing where I'm like, I'm not getting this. And so getting out of that hubris to be like, look, like what I'm trying, I know in my pseudocode or in my mind what I'm trying to do, but the syntax is just not coming with, is not here. And I might have written this 1 week ago and been able to do it, but today, like you will lose information on a regular basis. At least I do, where it's just like, I did this a couple days ago, but it's just not, that syntax is not clicking right now, and asking for help in that moment.
By the way, that's when you realize that the advocates that code is self-documenting and you shouldn't need to write comments operate in a philosophically pure environment that may not look very similar to your reality.
I'm personally, for those people, I can't wait for GPT-3 to get good enough to scrape through code, which it kind of does already, and spits out the intent of it into human readable language. So self-documenting code is going to be AI driven from here on out.
Yeah, there's a long list of AI driven promises going back to the 50s that haven't materialized.
We would not even need to write programs if AI can understand what we want. It just can understand.
Just tell it. We'll just tell it at that point. But then it takes my job away. So I'm just gonna say, going to keep it at self-documenting code and stop it
I
there.
feel like the demise of the professional programmer is greatly exaggerated.
It would all be pseudocode.
Yeah. Well, you do just to remember that COBOL was the common business object language because it was easier. And SQL was meant to be understandable by business people without the need to have programmers. There's a long history of technologies being invented to get rid of the need for programmers.
Yeah.
On our team, we want to definitely implement emoji code, and feel like that.
By the way,
going to
Ruby
the
does
future.
support emoji, so I mean you can totally use the calendar emoji as the name of your calendar class. I don't know if they did that at Calendly, but I've done that for giggles, and you can do calendar emoji.new, and it actually is syntactically valid.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Riaz, for the excellent presentation. And I feel like we all got something out of it, or at least a reminder of how we can do this better. And so any final parting questions from anyone? Well, we don't have to hang out to midnight, so I think we can get the rest of our evening back.